What if the belief holding you back is one you've never even questioned? There's a reason your life still feels like it's on pause, and it's not because you're lazy, unmotivated, or incapable. You've probably worked hard, reflected, tried to change your habits, maybe even consumed hours of content hoping for clarity. But what if the real thing holding you back isn't visible? What if it's a belief so embedded in your mind that you've stopped noticing it, like background noise you've been hearing your entire life? Most people never pause to ask this. Not because they don't want to change, but because the belief feels like truth. It's not loud. It doesn't announce itself. It just lives underneath every decision you make, every opportunity you avoid, every risk you hesitate to take. And because you've never questioned it, it continues to shape your life without resistance. It sounds like a story in your head, a silent rule, a quiet assumption that says, you're not ready, you don't have what it takes, they'll reject you if you try. Maybe it doesn't sound like fear, maybe it sounds responsible, cautious, even rational. That's what makes it dangerous. Because when a belief is wrapped in logic, it never feels like sabotage. It feels like self-protection. But protection from what? From rejection? From visibility? From the risk of getting it wrong? Or from the truth that if you actually tried and failed, there'd be no more excuse to hide behind. This is where most self-sabotage begins. Not with procrastination, not with fear, but with a belief that was installed, not chosen. A belief that made sense at some point, maybe even kept you safe, but now quietly dictates what you allow yourself to want. In this video, we're not going to throw affirmations at the problem. We're not going to talk about mindset shifts or willpower tricks. We're going to look beneath the surface and examine the operating system, the deep code that's been running in the background of your behavior, choices, and identity. And we'll start with a question you may have never asked yourself, because no one ever taught you to ask it. What if the belief holding you back isn't even yours? What if you've been living by someone else's fear, someone else's rules, someone else's emotional limitations, and calling it your own truth? If that's even slightly possible, then questioning it isn't just important, it's urgent. Because if you don't examine the belief, you'll keep changing the behavior but reliving the same outcome. And no amount of effort can override a belief your nervous system still thinks is true. So let's go beneath the habit, beneath the fear, beneath the version of you that keeps hesitating. Because it's not about becoming someone new. It's about remembering who you were before you were told who to be. The belief you didn't know you had. You don't wake up in the morning thinking about your beliefs. You think about your tasks, your schedule, the problems you need to solve. But under all of that, there's something far more influential quietly shaping your day, a belief you've never consciously chosen, but that's been making decisions on your behalf for years. It doesn't feel like a belief. It feels like reality. That's why it's so powerful. It's not, I believe I'm not good enough. It's, I just know I'm not ready. It's not, I believe I'll fail. It's now isn't the right time. These aren't opinions. They feel like facts. But they're not. They're invisible narratives installed at some earlier point in your life, often when you were too young to challenge them, and you've been running on them ever since. Here's how you know it's there. You hesitate at the moment you should act. You shrink when you should speak. You rationalize avoidance and call it patience. You call it timing. You call it strategy. But beneath all of that, there's a belief quietly whispering, don't. And it sounds so familiar, so practiced that you obey without even realizing it. This is the difference between knowledge and programming. You can know something logically. You can read the books, watch the content, talk to the therapist, and still revert to the same behaviors, because knowledge doesn't rewire belief on its own. Beliefs live in the subconscious, and the subconscious doesn't respond to theory. It responds to repetition, to perceived safety, to internalized emotion. Which means the belief you're operating from today might have nothing to do with who you are, and everything to do with what your nervous system learned you had to be. You learned to play small before anyone called it that. You learned to avoid failure before you ever called it fear. And the most dangerous part? You internalized it as your personality. That's the trap. The belief doesn't just shape your behavior. It becomes part of your identity. You don't just believe you can't take the risk. You believe you're not that kind of person. You don't just believe you're not ready. You believe people like you don't get to try. And once the belief fuses with your identity, it becomes self-reinforcing. You avoid the thing gives, you never gather proof you could do it. Gives so the belief stays intact gives. So you keep avoiding it gives, and the loop continues. But here's the insight that changes everything. If you didn't consciously choose the belief, then you don't have to keep defending it. You don't have to keep living by it. You can interrupt the cycle by doing something most people never consider: asking where the belief came from and whether it still serves who you are now. Because the belief was installed when you were surviving, but now you're trying to build a life. And survival code was never meant to run the system forever. When survival becomes identity, there's a moment in your life you probably don't remember. Not because it wasn't important, but because it was so early or so emotionally intense that your mind filed it under protection, not memory. It was the moment your nervous system made a choice to adapt, to play it safe, to survive. You weren't weak, you were smart. You read the room. You sensed what was safe and what wasn't, what was acceptable, expected, punished, or praised. And in that emotional environment, you built a way of being that allowed you to stay connected, to stay out of trouble, to stay unseen, or to stay in control. But here's where the problem starts. Survival strategies are useful only when you're in danger. Yet the mind doesn't always get the memo when the danger ends. The rule stays, the identity forms. And you keep living by it long after the original threat has disappeared. What once protected you becomes the lens through which you see yourself. You weren't told to stay small. You just learned that when you were visible, something bad happened. So you stopped shining, stopped asking, stopped risking. You weren't told you were too much. You just saw the discomfort on someone's face when you showed emotion, so you learned to suppress it. You weren't told not to dream. But every time you showed excitement, someone dismissed it, so you taught yourself not to hope. And over time, these behaviors stopped feeling like choices. They became habits, then personality traits, then identity. This is how protection becomes personality. Not because it reflects who you are, but because it kept you safe when you didn't have a better strategy. You don't call it survival anymore. You call it being realistic. You call it not wanting attention. You call it being independent, emotionally strong, logical. But look closer. So many of the traits you've built, the ones you're proud of, the ones you use to explain yourself, were formed under pressure. They're adaptations, not essence. And that matters. Because if your identity is shaped by who you had to be, not who you actually are, then at some point you'll start to feel trapped inside your own personality. This is when high-functioning self-sabotage shows up. You succeed just enough to prove you're fine, but you hold back just enough to stay safe. You seem in control, but inside there's friction. A quiet awareness that your behavior is filtered through rules you didn't consciously choose, and a life that feels slightly off, no matter how well you play the part. Here's the shift. Your personality isn't fixed. Your identity isn't final. If it was built under pressure, it can be rebuilt in clarity. You don't owe loyalty to a version of yourself that was designed to survive. You're allowed to outgrow the role and write a new one that aligns with your truth, not your past. The myth of "I should know better by now." You recognize the pattern. You see, it happened in real time. You even hear your own thoughts, the hesitation, the self-doubt, the avoidance, and part of you whispers, "Not again." But it still happens. And after, there's that one sentence that hits harder than the failure itself. "I should know better by now." It sounds like accountability. It sounds mature, responsible, self-aware. But under the surface, it's not. It's punishment disguised as growth. Because if you truly knew better in a way that had changed your internal wiring, you would act differently. The fact that you didn't isn't a sign of failure. It's a sign of unresolved programming still running in the background. Awareness is not transformation. Insight is not integration. Knowing the why doesn't erase the emotional imprint that belief left behind. Especially when that belief wasn't formed in your logical mind, it was formed in emotional context. You didn't just think it was true, you felt it. And your nervous system held on to that feeling as reality. Here's what no one tells you. Your conscious mind moves fast. It understands, reflects, rationalizes. But your subconscious mind moves slowly. It trusts patterns, emotional familiarity, and repetition. So you can consciously know better and still act like you don't. Not because you're weak, not because you're broken, but because your internal map hasn't updated yet. This is the gap that creates so much unnecessary shame. You blame yourself for not doing what your mind knows, instead of recognizing that your body and your belief system haven't caught up to your awareness. You say things like, "I always do this," I already worked on this. Why am I still here? And what you're really asking is, why hasn't the inside changed me? Because change isn't about what you think, it's about what your system believes is safe. And until the old belief is exposed, challenged, and slowly rewired, your nervous system will continue to default to the behavior that feels familiar, even if it contradicts your conscious goals. This is why self-awareness alone can become a trap. You become skilled at identifying the pattern, but still feel powerless to interrupt it. You see the loop. You hate the loop, but you stay in the loop. And that's when the shame creeps in. But shame doesn't create change. It deepens the grooves of the pattern. It tells your system, see? It's safer not to try. And so the loop gets stronger. Not because you're not growing, but because you haven't yet updated the internal rule that says, this is who I am. So here's the shift. Knowing better isn't a demand for perfection. It's the beginning of recalibration, not through force, but through repetition, compassion, and deliberate disruption of the old belief. You don't need more self-blame, you need self-leadership. Because awareness is not the end of the story, it's the opening scene. How familiar pain feels safer than freedom. You already know what's not working, the job that drains you, the relationship that silences you, the routine that numbs you. It's not that you're unaware of the pain. It's that part of you still believes staying in it is safer than leaving it behind. Not because it makes sense, but because it's familiar. And to the nervous system, familiarity is safety, not logic, not happiness, not fulfillment. Just what's been repeated enough times to feel predictable. The human brain is wired to conserve energy. It prioritizes known patterns over unknown outcomes, even if those patterns hurt. It doesn't ask, is this good for you? It asks, have we survived this before? And if the answer is yes, it marks it as safe, emotionally, psychologically, neurologically. This is why people stay in jobs they hate, relationships that dim their identity, routines that sabotage their growth. Not because they love the suffering, but because the alternative feels like a threat. A blank space. A future with no script. You might fantasize about freedom, but when it arrives, or even comes close, your system flinches. You second-guess it. You hesitate. You retreat into what's known. Because even though the pain is real, the process of becoming someone new feels even more destabilizing than staying stuck. And in that moment, the mind starts building a case. This isn't the right time. I'm not fully ready yet. What if it doesn't work? What if I lose everything I've built? It's not cowardice. It's biology. The part of your brain designed to keep you alive treats change like risk. Especially if the belief beneath the surface says, if I step into the unknown, I won't know how to protect myself. So the pain continues, quiet, chronic, managed. You learn how to tolerate it, rationalize it, normalize it. It becomes a lifestyle, a personality, a secret agreement you make with yourself. I'll stay here as long as I don't have to feel exposed. But here's the truth, and it's not motivational. It's neurological. If your system was programmed to equate safety with pain, then freedom will feel like fear at first. Not because it's wrong, but because it's unfamiliar. The goal isn't to force yourself to feel confident. It's to expand your window of tolerance for freedom long enough for your nervous system to realize you won't die if things get better. Because better isn't just something you choose. It's something you build capacity for. One emotionally regulated step at a time. You don't have to rush it. But you do have to stop confusing predictability with peace. Pain that you've learned to live with isn't a sign of strength. It's a sign that you've outgrown the belief that created it. And when that belief no longer fits, neither will the version of yourself who stayed just to feel safe. Beliefs don't live in words, they live in reactions. You might think you've already identified your limiting beliefs. You've journaled, reflected, maybe even named them. Fear of failure, fear of rejection, fear of not being enough. But beliefs don't show up as sentences in your mind. They show up in how your body responds the moment something unfamiliar enters the picture. You say you believe you're capable, but your chest tightens before you speak. You say you believe in your ideas, but your voice drops when you're challenged. You say you want change, but your energy disappears when it actually starts happening. That's not a thought problem. That's a belief wired into your nervous system. A belief that's lived through repetition, not logic. And until you feel it surface, you won't know it's still active. This is the trap for high-functioning thinkers. You believe that because you can articulate the issue, you've already outgrown it. But real beliefs don't live in your vocabulary. They live in your reactions, in the micro moments where your system decides what's safe without asking for permission. You flinch, you hesitate, you freeze, you downplay. Not because you think you're incapable, but because a part of you learned that visibility, boldness, or desire comes with emotional risk. And that part of you still runs the show when pressure hits. You can't outthink this. You can't mindset shift your way past a belief your nervous system still holds as truth. Because when the emotional memory of the belief is stronger than your intellectual awareness of it, your body will always override your mind. This is why change feels inconsistent. Some days you feel clear, aligned, capable. Other days, you shrink back into the version of you that reacts before you can redirect. And the more aware you become, the more frustrating it gets. Because now you see the pattern, but you still become it. That frustration is a sign that your mind is evolving faster than your nervous system. And that's not a failure. It's a cue to slow down and start reconditioning your system, not just analyzing your thoughts. So how do you do that? You stop chasing perfect clarity and start noticing your reactions. You train yourself to pause, not to suppress, but to observe. Because every involuntary response is a breadcrumb. A map back to the belief that taught you what to fear, what to suppress, what to avoid. Beliefs don't change when you name them. They change when you interrupt the moment they try to take over. And if you can stay present long enough to notice the reaction, without obeying it, you start teaching your system a new truth, that not every tension is a threat, that not every instinct deserves a response, and that the belief might not be yours anymore. It's just waiting for you to stop reacting and start leading. Internal rules that sound like facts. There are rules you live by that you've never actually spoken out loud. Not because they're true, but because they've been part of your inner world for so long that questioning them feels ridiculous. They sound like facts, but they're not. They're internalized beliefs that were never written down, never agreed to, never examined. You might recognize some of them. I'm not ready. People like me don't get to do things like that. If I slow down, everything will fall apart. If I'm not useful, I'm not valuable. If I speak up, I'll be misunderstood. If I try and fail, it'll prove what I already fear. No one gave you these rules directly. You absorbed them from small comments, repeated reactions, subtle signals in your environment. And over time, they stopped feeling optional. They became how things are. And the longer you live by them, the harder they are to see. This is the problem with belief systems built in childhood, trauma, or unchallenged environments. They disguise themselves as neutral observations. You don't even call them beliefs. You just assume they're true, but truth doesn't freeze you. Truth doesn't shrink your energy or hijack your confidence. What is that is unquestioned programming dressed up as maturity. These rules are rarely loud. They don't shout. They whisper. Right before you take the risk, you hear, "This isn't for you." Right before you share your idea, you feel they'll think you're arrogant. Right before you rest, the guilt creeps in. You haven't done enough. And because these rules are emotional, not verbal, they're hard to catch until you slow down and trace the feeling back to the thought back to the rule, and the rule back to its origin. This is where the shift begins. Not by forcing a new belief, but by identifying the rule underneath the behavior. You don't have a discipline problem. You have a rule that says your work only counts if it hurts. You don't have a self-worth issue. You have a rule that says value must be earned by over-delivering. You don't have an indecision habit. You have a rule that says failure is unforgivable, so every choice must be perfect. Once you identify the rule, you start noticing how often it shapes your choices. What you say yes to, what you say no to, what you don't even consider because the rule filtered it out before you had a chance. And then you realize something even deeper. These rules never came from your truth. They came from fear. Fear of being too much. Fear of being not enough. Fear of losing love, safety, belonging. But now you're an adult. You can love yourself without conditions. You can define safety on your own terms. You can belong without betraying your values. And that means you get to rewrite the rule, not all at once, but one conscious choice at a time. Because a rule you didn't create should never get to decide who you become. The emotional cost of letting it run unchecked. There's a cost to every belief you leave unexamined, And it's not just missed opportunities or goals you didn't reach. It's internal, quiet, cumulative. It shows up not in what you do, but in who you start believing you are. At first, it looks harmless. You delay a decision. You avoid a conversation. You stay in a routine that no longer fits. It doesn't feel like sabotage, it feels like life. Like being realistic, responsible, strategic. But over time, that pattern hardens into identity. You stop seeing yourself as someone who's choosing to play small and start seeing yourself as someone who is small. The belief becomes your baseline. And from that baseline, everything contracts. Your confidence, your energy, your capacity to imagine something different. It doesn't explode, it erodes. Not with one big moment of failure, but with 1,000 tiny decisions made through the lens of limitation. You start lowering the bar not because you want less, but because dreaming bigger creates friction with the belief that says you're not allowed to have more. And it's easier to settle than to live in constant contradiction with the part of you that still doesn't believe you deserve what you want. So you stop asking, you stop initiating, you stop trusting your own judgment. And without noticing, you hand over your self-leadership to the belief, letting it run the show while you call it realistic expectations. But there's a deeper cost, one most people don't talk about. It's not just your potential you lose. It's your trust in yourself. The kind of trust that says, when I want something, I'll move toward it. When I see a pattern, I'll disrupt it. When I feel fear, I won't obey it by default. Every time the belief wins and you don't interrupt it, a small part of you learns, I can't trust myself to follow through. And over time, that inner fracture becomes the story. I'm not consistent. I'm not disciplined. I'm not built for more. But none of that was true. What's true is this. You've been running an outdated belief with no checks and balances. A belief that once helped you survive, but now quietly erases the version of you trying to emerge. You can't afford to keep calling that belief just how I am, because it's not just limiting your goals. It's reshaping your sense of self. And the longer it goes unchallenged, the more distant you feel from who you were before the belief took over. This is the moment to pause. To not just notice the pattern, but name the cost. Because when the pain of staying the same becomes clearer than the fear of change, the belief loses power. And that clarity doesn't come from more effort. It comes from finally asking, who am I when I stop agreeing with the belief that keeps me small? The voice that's not yours, but still controls you. Not every thought in your head belongs to you. Some were inherited. Others absorbed. And most arrived long before you were old enough to question them. That voice in your mind, the one that interrupts your confidence, doubts your instinct, or warns you not to be too much, you've heard it for so long that you assume it's your own. But if you slow down, really slow down, you might notice something strange. It doesn't speak to you like someone who wants you to grow. It speaks like someone trying to keep you in line. And that voice usually has a source. It's the voice of the parent who criticized you in the name of discipline. The teacher who rewarded compliance more than curiosity. The sibling who mocked your enthusiasm. The environment that made safety conditional, perform well, or be punished. Don't ask for too much. Don't take up space. Don't break the mold. You internalized it. Not because you were weak, but because you were smart. You adapted. You picked up the emotional language of your surroundings and translated it into rules for survival, and you survived. But here's what no one told you. Just because the environment felt true, doesn't mean the messages were. When you're young, the brain is designed to imprint what's repeated. You don't evaluate it, you absorb it. Repetition becomes identity. So if you grow up around people who saw your needs as inconvenient, your ambition as unrealistic, or your voice as disruptive, your nervous system built a version of self that kept you safe in that context. But you're not in that context anymore. And yet, the voice still speaks. It questions your boldness. It tones you down before you express. It rewrites your decisions before you act, not out of wisdom, but out of habit. A habit of protection that outlived the danger. This is why people get stuck in invisible loops. They think they're making decisions freely, but they're actually filtering life through someone else's fear, someone else's scarcity, someone else's discomfort with who they were becoming. That voice might sound internal, but it was installed. And if it was installed, it can be uninstalled, but not through willpower alone. Through recognition. You have to name where it came from. And then, gently, firmly, start asking, does this still apply to me? Is this my truth or their echo? You are not obligated to carry someone else's emotional blueprint just because it shaped your early reality. You can honor your past without letting it dictate your future. And you can learn to recognize the difference between your voice and the one that taught you to fear your own power. Self-doubt isn't weakness, it's misdirected loyalty. You think you're doubting yourself because you're not good enough, not experienced enough, not ready. But what if that doubt isn't a sign of weakness? What if it's misplaced loyalty? You were loyal to the version of you who had to survive, to the identity that made sense in an environment that punished risk, visibility, or emotional honesty, to the dynamic where being quiet meant staying safe and being small meant being accepted. Self-doubt in that context wasn't self-sabotage. It was wisdom. It kept you tethered to the people you needed, the roles you had to play, the emotional structure you were raised in. You didn't question yourself because you were fragile. You questioned yourself because belonging depended on it. And over time, that strategy became familiar. So familiar that even now, as an adult, you feel guilt when you stretch past it. You feel tension when you step into confidence. You feel the internal resistance not because you're doing something wrong, but because you're breaking a quiet agreement you made with a past version of yourself. This is the hidden cost of growth that no one warns you about. It threatens the identities that once protected you. And sometimes it threatens the connection you had to the people who were part of that old version. So your system responds with doubt. Not because the new path is wrong, but because it disrupts the internal loyalty to the person you were when you learned to survive. You start asking, what will they think if I change? Who will I be if I no longer hold back? If I stop doubting myself? Will I still be me? These are not surface-level questions. These are existential fears that emerge when identity shifts. Because deep down, you know that changing what you believe about yourself means letting go of who you needed to be. And sometimes, letting go of the relationships, dynamics, or emotional roles that reinforce that identity. But here's what matters. Loyalty to an outdated version of you cannot create the life you want now. There's nothing noble about staying stuck in patterns that no longer serve you. You're not betraying your past by evolving. You're honoring it by refusing to stay frozen in it. Self-trust is not arrogance, it's maturity. It's the willingness to lead yourself, even when it feels unfamiliar. Even when part of you wants to look back and ask for permission. But you don't need permission to change. You only need the courage to disappoint the beliefs that once kept you safe, and the clarity to remember that doubt isn't a flaw. It's a signal. A signal that you're leaving the old agreement and stepping into the version of you who no longer needs it. Next up, Topic 10. How to disrupt a belief without forcing change. Type 1 to write the next topic, or type the changes you want. How to disrupt a belief without forcing change. The moment you realize a belief is holding you back, your first instinct might be to fight it, replace it, override it. And if you've been in the personal development world long enough, you've probably been told to do exactly that. Affirm the opposite, speak new truths, rewire your mind through repetition. But here's the problem. If your nervous system doesn't believe the new truth, it won't accept it. It won't internalize it. And it definitely won't act on it. Beliefs don't change because you yell louder. They change when your system no longer sees the old one as necessary. So the real question isn't, how do I force this belief to go away? It's, how do I make space for something new to feel safe? You don't have to bulldoze the belief. You have to disrupt its rhythm, because beliefs live in patterns. They're reinforced every time you feel a familiar emotion, tell the same internal story, avoid the same risk. So disrupting them isn't about drama. It's about friction. Small moments of contradiction that interrupt the loop just enough to create awareness, and then choice. That starts with one question. Is that still true? Not, is it bad? Not, do I hate it? Not, am I failing? Just, is that still true? You create a pause. A wedge between the automatic thought and your obedience to it. And in that pause, the belief loses some of its control. Not because it's gone, but because you're finally relating to it consciously, not reactively. Next comes curiosity. If your mind says, you'll mess this up, you don't respond with a fake affirmation. You ask, who taught me that? When did I start believing this? Do I have any proof that this is always true? Is this belief protecting me or just keeping me from being visible? That kind of questioning doesn't feel glamorous, but it's surgical. It doesn't spark adrenaline. It sparks awareness. And that's what changes behavior long term. Not hype, not pressure, not post-it notes with inspirational quotes. Then comes one small action that contradicts the belief without overwhelming the system. You don't go from hiding to performing on a stage. You go from silence to saying one honest sentence. From shrinking to holding eye contact. From I can't to maybe I don't have to obey this today. And that's how change begins. Through emotionally regulated disruption. The belief won't vanish overnight. It will resurface. It will push back. But with each conscious pause, each question, each micro-action that contradicts the old pattern, your system starts to trust that safety no longer requires self-suppression. And eventually, the belief that once felt like fact becomes just another idea, an echo, not an authority. Choosing what to believe on purpose. Once a belief loses power, there's an uncomfortable space that opens up. A kind of internal silence. The old narrative isn't fully in control anymore, but the new one hasn't taken shape. And that's where most people stop. Not because they don't want to grow, but because they don't know how to choose what to believe next. This is the part no one prepares you for. It's not enough to let go of the old story. You have to build a new one, not as a fantasy, not as a performance, but as a conscious, grounded decision based on who you actually are, not who you were trained to be. Beliefs aren't just statements. They're blueprints. They shape how you interpret discomfort, what you expect from yourself, what you tolerate from others. If you don't actively shape those expectations, they'll default to whatever programming has been running longest. So how do you start choosing on purpose? You start with data. Real data from your actual life, not from fear, not from memory, not from what someone else told you was true. You scan for the moments when you acted with clarity, spoke with conviction, moved toward something hard and didn't crumble. And even if they're small, you collect them. Because they're evidence, and beliefs built on evidence are harder to shake. Then you ask, what belief would I need to hold in order to move through life aligned with who I'm becoming? Not the most positive belief, the most functional one. The one that supports real movement without demanding perfection. It might sound like, I don't need to feel confident to take action. I can trust my judgment. Even when it's uncomfortable, I'm allowed to want more. Even if others don't understand. I don't need certainty. I need direction. These aren't affirmations, they're agreements. Internal contracts between your conscious mind and your evolving identity. And they only work if you commit to reinforcing them in real time. When the doubt returns, when the pattern resurfaces, when your nervous system reaches for the old belief out of habit, this isn't about eliminating fear. It's about anchoring yourself to a belief that makes movement possible, even with fear present. The more you act through the new belief, not because it feels true, but so that it becomes true, the faster your system rewires. The belief moves from theory into lived experience. And lived experience becomes identity. You stop performing confidence and start becoming someone who trusts their own clarity, not because the world gave you permission, but because you finally did. You're not broken, you're just living by outdated rules. There's a reason this has been so hard. Not because you're broken. Not because you lack discipline, awareness, or emotional strength. But because you've been trying to build a new life using the internal rules of an old one. Rules that were written in moments of pain. Rules that were shaped by people who didn't see you clearly. Rules that made sense when you were younger, smaller, scared, but no longer reflect the person you're becoming, and yet you kept obeying them. Not out of weakness, but out of habit. Because your nervous system thought those rules were still required to stay safe. So let's be honest. You've probably tried everything. Self-help, reflection, pushing harder, pulling back. You've read the books, taken the notes, asked the questions, and still, something kept looping. That something wasn't a flaw in you. It was a conflict between your conscious goals and your unconscious beliefs. A silent negotiation between the version of you that's ready to expand and the part that still thinks expansion will cost you. Something you can't afford to lose. Validation, connection, belonging, safety. But the truth is, most of the losses you're afraid of have already happened. You've already been rejected, doubted, dismissed, and you survived it. Which means you're no longer that version of yourself. You're no longer fragile in the ways you once were. You're not unfinished. You're unupdated. You're not broken, you're misaligned. Still following the rules of an old emotional system that has no business running your present identity. So what happens when you stop? When you stop filtering your decisions through fear-based logic. When you stop shrinking just to keep peace with an outdated version of yourself. When you stop seeking permission to be someone your younger self didn't have the tools to become. What happens is this: the belief loses power. The identity begins to shift. And clarity, the kind you don't have to perform, begins to settle in. This isn't about becoming someone new. It's about remembering who you were before the rules were written. Before you were taught that safety required self-silencing. That love required proving. That success required suffering. Those rules were never universal. They were emotional. And you don't have to keep living by them. Because the truth is, you were never behind. You were never stuck. You were just loyal to a system that forgot how much you've already grown. And now, you don't have to be. You can lead yourself forward, not by fixing what's wrong, but by choosing what's true. Starting now.